Cute. Well, let's wait for a few more of those to come in. I'm loving what I'm reading, such a diverse group really committed to this topic. So we'll welcome more participants as they come, but I also want to be really mindful of our time today. So let's get things started. So good morning, everyone, and welcome to this session titled Attending to Invisible Wounds, Trauma-Informed Teaching as part of the Disability Symposium at the College of Arts and Sciences. My name is Erin Cunningham, Director of Wellness and Employee Engagement for the College of Arts and Sciences, and I'll be the host for today's discussion. Before we begin, I'd like to note that people without vision disabilities take in a lot of information about the people and environment around them. So in order to offer context and access for all, I'll provide a brief visual description of myself. I'm joining this session from my home workspace, which includes a simple background of 2 mirrors on the wall behind me. I'm a white female with long, dark brown hair in my mid-40s. My attire is business casual, and I'm wearing a collared shirt. I do want to note before we begin that participants can enable live transcription by clicking on the CC button on the Zoom menu bar. Before we kick off today's session, I'd like to share a little bit more about the Disability Symposium and also read the CU Land Acknowledgement. The University of Colorado Boulder is hosting this Disability Symposium to acknowledge that more work must be done to improve inclusion of persons with disabilities on the Boulder campus. Efforts to improve inclusion must focus on students, staff, and faculty. The 2021 CU Boulder Campus Climate Survey Report, which was released in April of 2022, found that 44% of undergraduate students and 47% of graduate students reported experiencing incivility in the prior 12 months. For students with disabilities, these numbers climbed to 54% and 62% respectively. This symposium is a springboard to begin campus-wide conversations on how each of us can improve inclusion on campus and improve support for all persons with disabilities. Additionally, as one of the symposium organizers, I would also like to take a moment to read the CU Land Acknowledgement. The University of Colorado Boulder, Colorado's flagship university, honors and recognizes the many contributions of Indigenous peoples in our state. CU Boulder acknowledges that it is located on the traditional territories and ancestral homelands of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Ute, as well as many other Native American nations. Their forced removal from these territories has caused devastating and lasting impacts. While the University of Colorado Boulder can never undo or rectify the devastation wrought on Indigenous people, we commit to improving and enhancing engagement with Indigenous peoples and issues locally and globally. We do this specifically by recognizing and amplifying the voices of Indigenous CU Boulder students, staff, and faculty, as well as their work. We do this by educating, conducting research, supporting student success, and integrating Indigenous knowledge. We do this by consulting, engaging, and working collaboratively with tribal nations to enhance our ability to provide access and culturally sensitive support and to recruit, retain, and graduate Native American students in a climate that is both inclusive and respectful. Now, I am very pleased and honored to introduce Dr. Melanie Peffer, who is a teaching assistant professor in the Health Professions Residential Program and a research scientist with the Institute of Cognitive Science at CU Boulder. Today, Dr. Peffer will discuss key principles of trauma-informed teaching and how to recognize signs of trauma and differentiate it from stress. Peffer will address strategies for relationship building to keep open communication pathways with students and how previous traumas influences learning in the classroom. Peffer will also discuss the role of power in the classroom, how power dynamics can worsen trauma symptoms, and how to use evidence-based strategies such as co-design to minimize power dynamics. I'm thrilled to be able to welcome Dr. Peffer, and let's all give her a warm welcome.
All right, wonderful. Thank you for that kind introduction, Erin, and thank you everybody for being here today. I'm super excited to share this talk with you. I'm energized by how many people care about trauma-informed teaching. It's wonderful. It's an inclusive pedagogy, which is something that I care a lot about. So how I like to give presentations on Zoom is that I like it to be very interactive. So I ask a lot of questions. We're going to be working with the chat window today so that everybody has a chance to chime in, and also in the breakout rooms. If you prefer to keep your camera off while I have the slides up, that's fine. That will help minimize your Zoom fatigue. But if we're all discussing together and you don't mind having your camera on, that would be great. I'll also have frequent breaks for questions as well. And here's all my contact information. Because I'm an author in my life outside of the university, I have a lot of social media presence, and I'm always posting little tidbits of what's going on. And I've included my email address as well. Okay, so trauma. What do you think of when I say the word trauma? So put your thoughts in the chat window, please. If I say trauma, what do you think of? What does that mean to you? So lingering damage from, is it Avedon?
Avedon.
Avedon, thank you. So from Tina, something that gets in the way. So Kara or Kara, I'm not sure which it is, something long lasting. It's something's traumatic. Lauren is pointing to events in the world, have some kind of long lasting impact. So David, bringing up secondary trauma, that's one of the last things we'll talk about today, is secondary or vicarious trauma. So the nervous system, that's something I've learned a lot about my own self with as a trauma survivor, and the dysregulation of the nervous system. Responses to a harmful event from Vanessa. Yes, that's something we'll be talking about today too. What's the difference between being adjacent to a traumatic event and actually developing PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder? So I'm going to wait a second to see if anybody else has something to share. All right, great. So thank you everybody for chiming in. So trauma brings up a lot of different things for people. Some people go to that view of the ER room, the trauma center, where trauma is a visible wound or condition that we can see. And a lot of people talk about people who were in military service in reference to trauma and PTSD. You know, it's interesting. I've had that question asked in the clinic when it says in my records that I have PTSD, and people are like, oh, what branch of the military were you in? I'm like, well, there's other ways you develop PTSD. Someone mentioned in the chat window about current events. You know, I've heard the COVID pandemic described as a collective traumatic experience for people. And I'm guessing most people in this room remember when 9/11 happened, can remember where you were when that happened, which was also, I would argue, a very collective traumatic experience. And so it's also not just experiences or things that happen once off. There's also chronic trauma. So people who have experienced abuse, assault, or childhood neglect. These are all things that can feed into trauma or be what people think about when we talk about trauma. So when we bring this back to CU Boulder's campus, I'm guessing I'm not the only one who was teaching during the 2021 school year. This was probably my most difficult year in the classroom. So that was the year that it was our first COVID fall, with everybody back in the classrooms for the first time after the pandemic. That was the year of the Cameron Peak fire, when it was raining ash on campus. And then that spring was when the King's shooting happened. And so I feel like on campus collectively, it was a very traumatic school year. And I remember my heart just aching for my first year students going through all of that while trying to adjust to college life. Okay, so these are pictures and things we think of when we think about what trauma is. And so if we want to get down to the nitty-gritty of it, trauma is from the Greek word for wound. And although we can think about a trauma department, where someone has fallen off a ladder and they've broken a leg and they need to go to the trauma center, what I'm going to be talking about today is the trauma that we can't see, the invisible wounds. So if we look at the American Psychological Association, they say it's an emotional response to some kind of terrible event. We also have incidences of when someone is repeatedly exposed to some kind of traumatic events, such as repeated assault, domestic violence, childhood neglect. And the thing with trauma is that it's actually very common. About 50 to 60% of people will witness a traumatic event. And traumatic events range wildly. We've all seen car accidents, or have been in car accidents, or have witnessed the aftermath of car accidents. Discrimination is another example. Assault, world events such as 9/11 or the COVID pandemic. The key to remember, and I'll bring this up a couple of times when we think about the trauma-informed teaching as an inclusive pedagogy, is that trauma is an individual experience, but it can be experienced collaboratively. It can be something that we experience together as a group of people on campus when there was a shooting close to our campus. But how people respond is very individual, because we all were a part of that if we were on campus at that time, but people respond differently to it. And so one thing I'm not going to talk about today, but I'm happy to chat about in the question and answer section, is things how there's genetic components to developing post-traumatic stress disorder after experiencing a trauma. Okay, so that's a good segue into post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. So trauma is different from PTSD. You can have a traumatic experience, you can witness a car crash and be shaken up about it, but not everybody who experiences trauma develops PTSD. It's a much smaller percentage of people who develop PTSD. And so this is a pathological response to trauma. And so although 40 to 60% of people will experience some kind of traumatic event, only about 4 to 8% develop PTSD. Also note that it's about twice as many women as men develop PTSD. So I want to point out, someone brought this up in the chat window too, that there's two kinds of PTSD, although the DSM only recognizes one. I'm in camp that they really need to recognize both. So there's incident-related PTSD. So I have a friend who was in a plane crash, and he received very targeted treatment before he could actually get back on a plane again. That's different from chronic abuse. This leads to the development of something called complex PTSD. And so this is when some kind of traumatic experience happened repeatedly over many years. So for example, childhood abuse or neglect often leads to adults with complex PTSD. And how does this fit into the Disability Symposium? PTSD is a disability covered under the Americans with Disabilities Act. And as you've probably guessed from this talk, it's something that can come up in our classrooms. And so my goal today is to really help you equip you with the skills to be able to recognize when this is happening in the classroom, how it can manifest in the classroom. So really thinking carefully about the content that we teach, and then what to do about it, so that you leave here with some good strategies. And like I said, we'll also spend a good bit of time in breakout rooms so that you can brainstorm this on your own. Okay, so the first important thing to keep in mind is, how do we differentiate trauma from stress? Students get stressed out, but how do we know if we need to refer them out to CAPS, for example, or if it's just something that we can model of, hey, this is how I manage stress? There's overlap in symptoms. That's why it can be hard to tell trauma from stress. Both trauma and stress can manifest as headaches, body tension, insomnia, and nausea. One of the differences is if somebody has PTSD, there's some kind of strong or unpredictable emotional response. Students who get really upset about an exam, for example, or be sobbing in your office after an exam. There's flashbacks. And I also want to point out that flashbacks aren't just, again, what we see in the movies sometimes, where someone has, like, they're reliving the experience. It can also be an emotional flashback. And so that's when someone relives the emotional experience. So for example, someone with complex PTSD may get an email from a colleague and then be right back to being that child being yelled at by a parent. Nightmares is another hallmark of PTSD as well. And sometimes people are aware of the symptoms of trauma, but when it's the case of CPTSD and it's a part of someone's upbringing, they're not always aware that what they're experiencing is trauma. That was part of my experience where everybody just said, oh, you're a graduate student, you're just anxious. And so it was a long time before I started getting proper treatment because everybody just said it was anxiety. And so, a lot of people report feeling like they're crazy because of how they feel after the incident when they're not crazy. It's just that that's actually a normal way that our bodies respond to trauma. So I'm going to share this tip. This tip gets emailed out by the university every fall, I feel like, is to make sure that you have a red folder on your computer. And I'll bring this up again at the end. Have that contact information for SSCM, the Student Support Case Management, OVA, Office of Victim Assistant, and CAPS, Counseling and Psychological Services, on your computer where you can access it quickly. So if you start to see a student or a student discloses that they're having a lot of nightmares to you, you can get them to help right away. I think that's one of our important jobs as faculty, is being that first line of contact for students to get them the support they need. Okay, so I think it's important to model how to deal with stress, and there's some of these techniques that also help with trauma as well. So using the five senses, so grounding yourself with what you can see, smell, taste, feel, and hear. So this is something I actually bring up with students when they tell me that they're having trouble with anxiety. As we talk about, okay, how do you ground yourself before you go into the exam? Breathing exercises, 5-finger breathing is one of my favorites, where you breathe up as you go up your finger and then back down. And then you just go like this. There's also the in 3, hold 6, out 9, or circle breathing as well. Some of these don't work as well for students with trauma, but I feel like if we're just trying to help students feel less stressed out in the classroom, all of these can really help. And, modeling is super important. Modeling is a very important way for how people learn. And students look to us for this. So I strongly encourage students to have a life outside of class. And I model that for my students. We open class with a soft warm up of, hey, what did we do this weekend? So I really strongly encourage students to run, do something they like to do meditation, do yoga, play a video game. I really shocked a student the other day. He's like, I'm in college now, I can't play video games. I'm like, hey, if it helps you feel less stressed out, go for it. Just don't do it for 8 hours in a row. So how do we know if someone is struggling with stress or trauma? And I can't emphasize this enough, the importance of building relationships with students. And so here's a couple of things that I do with my students so that I can, again, be that first line for students. So I'm in the residential academic program. I'm lucky that I only have, 20 students in each of my classes. So I get to know them all really well. And as such, I'm often one of the people that they disclose to when there's something going on. So I have conferences with my students every semester. I meet with each one individually outside of class. I try to make a point of talking to each student in class, every class period. I open up the semester with an ask me everything, anything open activity. So I introduce myself and say they can ask me anything they'd like to know. And I do my best to be a real person to them. Listening is also very, very important. So this gets back to what I was saying about people experience trauma differently. You may be looking back and being like, you know what, the COVID pandemic really just didn't bother me that much. Might be a totally different experience for someone else. So it's always really important that we listen to what students say is going on in their world rather than putting our own thoughts on it. It's a matter of checking our biases. Okay. So those are my examples. So now I'm going to stop talking for a minute and give you a chance to think. And then we'll just do this one in the chat window. We'll go to the breakout rooms next. And I'm going to decat my office because they're in here raising havoc. So think about this for a minute. What do you do to build relationships with your students? If you're not in the classroom, what's something else that you can think of to build relationships with others? So that there's this gateway that's open up so we can see if our students are dealing with stress or they're dealing with trauma. So after you think about it for a minute, go ahead and put your thoughts into the chat window. So if you're writing, go ahead and keep writing. I'm just going to read some of the responses in the chat window to try and summarize this. Seems like some people do things that are similar to what I do. Tina brought up about chatting with students about non-class topics before school, so you come across as a real person and so that they're comfortable talking to you. I always tell my students when I do my introduction activity at the beginning of the semester, it's much easier to start a conversation with me about my cats or what books I'm reading than it is to dive right in and say, hey, I really don't understand ester bond formation. So I like Gavin's suggestion. I wish I had the time to do this, about doing a debrief after an exam that's in person, face to face, because I already forgot, a Vaden. Sorry, I think I'm pronouncing that wrong. I do something similar to this where I do kind of asynchronous reflections. I like Gavin's suggestion about doing it synchronous at the same time, especially because students get very keyed up about their exams. So Rachel was bringing up, even though not in the classroom, but having these informal conversations with graduate students. It's really amazing how much just those informal interactions can make people feel comfortable and help us best support the students. Oh, Vanessa brings up an excellent point about saying that they like teaching and like talking and answering their questions. I try to do this as well. And yes, this issue where students think that asking a question is an imposition. I've run into this semester. I've seen it more than any other time. I have a student who apologizes every time he asks a question. And I'm like, you don't have to apologize. I'm here to answer your questions. I'm going to give it a few more seconds to see if anybody else has any other ideas before we move on. So there was a question, which is fine. So going into the question section next. So the differences between the people who experience trauma. So about 40 to 60% of people will experience some kind of traumatic event. And that can be anything that we would consider more run-of-the-mill, such as a car accident, to these kind of once-in-a-lifetime experiences, such as the COVID pandemic. But about 4% of men and 8% of women actually go on to develop post-traumatic stress disorder. Did that answer your question?
Thank you. Yeah, I caught the 4 to 8, but I missed that 40 to 60. So thank you for saying it again.
Yeah, absolutely. I think people miss how common traumatic experiences actually occur. Because again, there's still this overarching misconception that I've run into with the public that if you have experienced trauma or have PTSD, that must mean that you are in the military service. Are there any other classroom or just reading classroom on my slide? Are there any other questions before we go on? Okay, so relationship building with students is really important. It's an important gateway for us to see what's going on and take the temperature in our classrooms. So the other important thing is how our content can trigger people's trauma or be re-traumatizing. So I would argue, and a lot of other people argue this too, if you've read any of the literature on inclusive teaching, that inclusive and effective teaching is also trauma-informed teaching. So what is the root of trauma-informed teaching? What does it mean to be a trauma-informed teacher? Really, it comes down to we don't want to re-traumatize our students. And so how do we do that? And that's what this next section is going to focus on. So the first thing is to know your content. It seems kind of obvious. If you have a PhD and you're teaching in it or you're working a PhD in it, you should know your content really well. But I think it's that deeper content knowledge of how does this content that I'm teaching fit into bigger questions about social norms, social histories that could be triggering. And again, that having those relationships with your students, listening to what they say, can be a really good clue for you if you need to add a trigger or a content warning before you get into topics. And I'll give an example of how that comes up in my molecular biology classes in just a minute. So the kind of going with the know your content, be aware of the social history that intersects with your content and how that can manifest in the classroom. So for example, I teach in the sciences. I'm a science communicator as well. There are groups of people who were hurt by scientists. And that needs to be acknowledged, and that can factor into how people are coming into the classroom and engaging with content. So if people belong to a group that was hurt by scientists, hurt by physicians, and they have to come into our classrooms and take a science class, that trauma experience by their group that they belong to can influence how they're learning in the classroom. They may feel just immediately uncomfortable walking in the door because of some kind of societal history. People that were impacted by natural disasters. So it's easy to sit in, for example, like a geology class and talk about these wonderful phenomenon because it's so interesting to talk about volcanoes and earthquakes and everything. But, there are people who are affected by these things too. And so it has to be tempered a little bit with hey, we're going to be talking about plate tectonics. And as part of it, we're also going to be mentioning about, this earthquake disaster that happened. Prior experience. So what students are bringing into the classroom is important. And this relates back to where I started with the relationships. Is a student experiencing run-of-the-mill test anxiety, or were they previously abused about their exam performance, either by a parent or another teacher or some kind of authority figure in their life? And so again, having those conversations about, do they just get the butterflies when they take their exam and that's why they're struggling? Or are they having nightmares and flashbacks and having a terrible time on the exam, and we need to make a referral out to CAPS or OVA? So I want to bring up the comment in the chat window too, about as faculty, we're used to our content. That's such a good point. And students might not be. And so the example is, don't blink an eye at a character killing lots of people in a medieval saga, but to a student, it can be very alarming the first time they see it. That's a great example. And it's a good segue into our Think, Pair, Share about what content do you teach that could be re-traumatizing or triggering. So for example, in the spring, I teach genetics, and in the genetics course, I do 2 topics, probably more than 2 topics. These are just the 2 that come to mind that are definitely trauma triggers for some people. And the first one is we talk about the biology of miscarriage. So that women who've experienced pregnancy loss, about 20% of the time will develop PTSD as a result. So I put a trigger warning up for that. And the other one is we talk about the non-genetics of race and how there is no biological basis for race, racial purity, any of that. So I do trigger warnings for those as well. So again, I'll give you a minute. It's 11:31 according to my clock. At 11:32, we're going to open up the breakout rooms for about 5 minutes. And so I'd like you to share with your partner, what content do you teach or have you taught in the past that could be re-traumatizing or triggering to someone? And if that still doesn't fit you, you can maybe just come up with your own example of your favorite topic and how something within that could be re-traumatizing or triggering to a student.
Melanie, go ahead if you're ready to start those.
Okay, I will go ahead and open up the breakout rooms. There's the option. If you would like me, I'm going to try to rotate through, but with as many people as here, it might take me a minute. If you want me to come by sooner, you can use the raise hand feature and I'll come by. Okay, everybody should have an invitation.
Thanks, Melanie. I wasn't sure. I thought Braz was gonna do that.
It's fine. Yeah, I wasn't sure because I don't mind opening the breakout rooms. It's more so if we have a bunch of people asking questions that gets a little distracting in the chat window.
Yeah, I hear you.
Okay, so I opened the breakout rooms at 11:33. I'm gonna give people maybe a minute or two to start chatting with each other. And then I'm gonna try to rotate through all the rooms.
Sure.
And
then I'll have you call everyone back, or do you want me to at a certain time?
I can call everybody back, although I wouldn't necessarily go past 11:40 because then we'll debrief as a group till about 11:45. Sure. And that gives 15 minutes for the second activity.
Okay.
And the last few slides on power dynamics. I want to make sure I talk about power dynamics because a lot of people don't think about that as being something that's in the classroom that can be re-traumatizing to people.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to that.
Okay. I will rotate through. Do you want to stay in the main room in case someone gets booted out?
I'll stay in the main room. Good luck in the ether.
Thanks.
breakout room. So the rest of the group will be turning in just a minute. Hey, Charlie, the group is in breakout sessions and they're going to rejoin the larger group in just a minute.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Sorry, I mixed up my dates.
Well, and it's like, wait, what's going on? You just have this one lady sitting here.
I couldn't figure out how to get my audio on. I'm very silly right now.
It's fine. We're welcome. We're glad to have you.
Thank you. Okay. I'll stay until it comes back.
They'll come back any minute.
Awesome. Thank you.
Hmm? Welcome back.
Everybody's probably still chatting. Usually when I close the breakout rooms and no one comes back, it's because everybody's having really good conversation, which is a good
Yes,
sign.
good sign. Excellent.
I think in the interest of time, I'm going to go straight into the power in the classroom
Great.
and final thoughts to try and save a couple of minutes at the end for questions.
I think that's great. Yeah, it looks like you've got a really engaged group, so
Yeah.
I'll probably want to chat a little bit.
It seems like this might be a good workshop to run by CTL to see if they would want to do
Yes.
this as a
Yes.
longer session.
It would really complement, they just gave a session before you. I don't know if you were on it, but it would be a great compliment. Welcome back, everyone.
Hello, everyone. Okay, so we're going to just take 2 minutes to debrief. So would someone like to share an insight that they learned in their breakout room? And if you don't want to unmute and talk in front of the class, you can always private message me and I can read your response and not identify you too. A lot of my students like that option. I was sick a couple of weeks ago and we moved class online. And I told students about that option. I had so much more participation that day. It was incredible. So yes, if you want to text me your messages in the chat window, I can read them too.
Well, I can share something that Tina and I talked about. That I think this was when you came through the room too, that sometimes the things that are the most like interesting or cool to one student might also be the most likely to trigger trauma in another student. So since we're both earth scientists, we were talking about natural disasters and extreme events being like that.
Yes, I was in the room for that. And this is something I run into teaching genetics too. We talk about rare genetic diseases and we're talking about the molecular mechanisms in class. I see this in a lot of biology classes where people focus on the disease and the process underlying it and how this happens without being like, oh no, this is like a real thing that affects real people. Anyone else have something they'd like to share from their rooms? Emmy, go for it.
Yeah, sorry, I don't have a working camera on this computer, so
It's okay.
I can't turn my camera on. But one of the things we talked about in my group was the idea of like personal narratives of trauma being part of course content, and how this happens a lot in my teaching in the Spanish department. And one of the things that I make an effort to include those narratives, because I think that you know, counter narratives or counter storytelling that are going to go against the dominant narratives are really important to include, but also can sometimes be the most difficult or most traumatizing for students. So trying to find ways to balance that, you know, these are the narratives we need to really be paying attention to, but also these are the ones that could potentially be the most difficult or traumatizing for students to be engaging with.
Yeah, that's a great point too, that it's, especially when we're thinking more about justice in education too, it's really important that we hear those counter narratives. And it can be difficult for people to hear. And so it's how we go about packaging it that I think is the most important. Okay, I know you told me, and I said it wrong once.
Avedon.
Avedon, thank you.
Not a problem. So sort of hopping off of that, we talked a bit about how we, if we're going to teach content that is, that could be objectionable or re-traumatizing, then contextualize why we're doing this. For example, I teach a class on Scandinavian folklore, and I'm doing a survey, and that includes, I've decided that I'm going to include stories that I find personally objectionable, like stories that have sexual violence, gendered violence, violence against the disabled and against the elderly. But I tell my students, okay, so here's why I'm showing these things, because we're doing a survey that includes a broad survey of these stories. I don't like them. Let's talk about why these are uncomfortable stories to read, but let's also maybe talk about they were told and retold and written down. Therefore, several someones thought they had value. What value might they have had? And then what has changed in our society such that these were fun stories to tell 400 years ago, but absolutely not fun at all right now. And I think that if I telling students why we're covering the uncomfortable stories. It shows them that I've thought about it, that I'm not just, oh, hey, let's do this, gratuitously awful story. Let's try to shock someone. But it also gets them thinking about how different stories can have different values to people.
Thank you, Abadan. I think that's a wonderful example. And it gets back to this point of how do we package our content? And it's not necessarily about getting rid of all of it. And that's, I think that's a lot of educational value too, is how is this different? How did cultures experience these stories before? What was their value? And how is that different from how we see it today? Is also just such a wonderful educational opportunity too. So thank you for sharing that. Okay, so in the interest of time, we're going to go into my slides on power. So I know a lot of people were interested in this section of the talk particularly. And so power dynamics come up in any kind of relationship. And it's definitely something that we see in the classroom because, oh, I thought I had a note on this. The professor inherently has power over the students, just like any kind of supervisor has power over their employees. And it's how we manage that power that's very important. So when we look at incidences of trauma, whether this is post-traumatic stress disorder or complex post-traumatic stress disorder, that many incidences of trauma are come about because of some kind of power imbalance. Sometimes this is the inability, the lack of power to prevent a death, to prevent an accident. Sometimes it's because someone doesn't have the power to get away from their abuser or to get away from an assault that they're experiencing. And so this is where, again, we come back down to these evidence-based inclusive classroom practices that we know already create safe places for learning, but they also create a shared power dynamic so that that isn't re-traumatizing to students. So tips, I think, a lot of this starts with just the acknowledgement that the professor is the giver of grades. Is the person who says what we're doing in class that day, and there is going to be a power imbalance. That doesn't mean it has to be all in the professor's hand, though. So there's lots of ways that we can share power in the classroom. So one of the main ones that I do is co-design. I let students co-design the class wherever possible. So for example, on my syllabus, there's a big blank space with their class expectations. And on the first day of class, I have students come up with their expectations for me as their professor, what they expect from their peers, and what I can expect from them. And that becomes a Word document that's an addendum to our syllabus so that students have a say in how class goes. I do students' choice wherever possible. So this could be assignments. So usually if we have a capstone assignment, I say, here's 2 or 3 options that you can pick to do this assignment, whatever you think is going to show your knowledge best. Some classes can do this in terms of exams. You can have an oral exam, you can have a written exam, you can write a paper. So that students have the ability to shine whatever way they shine best. And then in the case of any kind of rewards or how do you want to review for your exam is something that I do. We have our MCDB 1150 exams are on Monday nights. And so I went to the students and said, okay, you're giving up time outside of our scheduled class period to take your exam. What would you like to do differently in class? And so the students actually all came back and said, hey, you know what? We really don't want to have class on Halloween. And so that was their reward, so to speak, for getting some of that time back that they spent online taking an exam. Okay, so I don't think we have time to go back into the breakout rooms right now, unfortunately. So I want to make sure we get everybody out of here on time. So just in the chat window, what are some ideas that you have about how you can share power in your classroom? And again, if you're not teaching, what's a way you can share power with someone that you work with or someone that you're in some kind of power relationship with? This could also be the relationship you have with your kids if you happen to be kids or have kids. So letting students resubmit assignments, I think that's a great one. I love letting my students do exam corrections. It's also a great one for metacognitive learning as well. Yeah, because really at the end of the day, we want to see their growth. At least that's what I care more about. It's not their grades that they get, it's the growth that they have over the course of the semester. Oh, I like this idea from Lauren, letting students vote on the due date. We do a lot of voting in my classes as well. Anytime something comes up where we have to course correct, I'm like, all right, what do you want to do? Grading rubrics, letting students have input on grading rubrics. That's a wonderful idea. Also a very inclusive pedagogy. Choices from David, yes. So we've done love and logic parenting with our kids, and the basis of love and logic parenting is to provide choices. That's a great one. So Kara, this sounds like an interesting idea. And if you don't mind unmuting, I'd like to hear more about how feminist theory informs this co-design student choice. You don't have to unmute, but I would love to hear you talk more about it.
Yeah, I'm totally happy to. Yeah, I'm taking a class in the School of Ed, and Liz Meyer's running the class, and Liz tries to bring feminist theory into the classroom. So it's sort of like she also changes the dynamics of the classroom so that it responds to more of that idea of we're not just having like the one person in front, lecturing. So a lot of the things you're already talking about, Melanie, but I think it's just this idea of feminism kind of like shaking it up. Flipping things on its head, like queer theory and feminist theory both do that, where they sort of reverse a lot of like whatever is traditional. It's like, well, why does it have to be traditional? Let's mess with it, and just that kind of a freedom to mess with what exists. So that I think really shifts power dynamics when you just don't, when people don't just automatically go with what they were brought up to do in a classroom.
Oh, got it. That makes a lot of sense. So it kind of comes down to doing things differently, because I think it could also come as a surprise when we let the students dictate more of how class is going too. That's a wonderful point. Thank you for bringing that up.
Mm-hmm.
So it looks like Vanessa and Rachel both brought up this idea of mid-semester, mid-program feedback. I do that as well. I always tell students I want to know what's not working now so I can fix it now for them. So Maya's bringing up a question about how do you provide choices on a performance-based class like public speaking? And I wonder if you can provide choices on the nature of the public speaking that they're doing. So for example, can you give them the option to do it in class in front of real people, or could they record it so that they're just talking to their computer, which some people really don't like talking to their computer. But I wonder if that's where you could get that choice in of what media did they want to do it in, or even going to one of the studios on campus and actually being in a recording studio. Okay, so I have one final slide with my final thoughts, and then I'll open the floor for questions with the last couple of minutes. I've really appreciated all the conversation and perspectives we've had today. So at the beginning, someone brought up secondary trauma. It's also called vicarious trauma. And this happens when we come into contact with people who've experienced trauma. And so this is just about protecting ourselves and keeping ourselves healthy too. That if we are going to be open and receptive and having relationships with the people around them, and something happens to them or they share a trauma, that can negatively impact us. So make sure you're always watching out for your own well-being. Part of inclusive practice is admitting we don't know everything. We don't know everything about how people respond to trauma, what is going to be re-traumatizing to them. One of the breakout rooms I was in, someone shared about how there was a presentation by graduate students on the resources available on campus. And the presentation happened to be triggering to someone in attendance, even though the intention was just about, hey, we have an Office of Victim Assistance on campus. And so it's really important that we're always receptive to feedback. And I really feel like a lot of inclusive practice just comes back to being kind and treating others with respect. And so if someone says, hey, that really didn't work for me, then it's like, all right, well, next semester, would it help if I added a trigger warning? So when things don't work well for my students, I usually come back and say, hey, would it help if we did it this way next semester? So then it's not on them to give me the ideas, but I could at least run those ideas past them. Also, just remembering that your experience isn't necessarily someone else's experience. So I'm a lost mom. I've lost 2 babies before. And so people's responses to hearing about miscarriage is that you can have full-on PTSD from having a miscarriage. For other people, it's just, oh, it's sad, too bad, you'll have to try again. And that's the experiences that moms have from it. And it makes it very hard to talk about it with other people too. And so just always, your experience isn't someone else's. And again, I can't emphasize this enough. Make sure you have a red folder on your computer so that you can pull up the information for SSCM, OVA, CAPS, non-emergency line at the university, anytime you have a student in front of you who needs your help. So with that, I want to thank all of you for being here today, for being such participative attendees. I've learned a lot today. I hope you have learned something too. Feel free to reach out if you have any questions. And with that, I'll open the floor for questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Melanie. I just want to note there's a couple comments in the chat.
Okay, comments that are questions or comments that are...
Oh, so Evenden says, I've had so many students who have been so traumatized by having to prove their absence is legit.
Yes.
That it's given me secondary trauma. She says that, so for example, a student sent a picture of her fiance in the ER after a gunshot wound and proof that things were bad and begging for an extension on assignments, which leads her to say, of course she got them. And now I don't check my work email in bed. And there's some kind of
my first thought was, who hurt you? Why that you felt like you needed to do this to yourself and to me? And then I thought, oh wait, I know who hurt you. All the professors were like, no, you have to have this, proof of death kind of thing. So that just made me really sad.
Yeah,
really
I've
sad.
seen that come up before. I remember when I was a student, there was a professor who required sending in the obituary if you had to miss class because of a death in the family. And it was inspired because she had so many people lying to her about it. But at the same time, I always tell students that they don't need to tell me why they're missing class. They just need to email me before class and say, hey, I'm not coming today. And I don't need to know if it's because their girlfriend or boyfriend broke up with them, they're hungover. I don't care. I don't care. They don't have to disclose it. And I also, for my personal protection, I don't get push notifications on my work email. And I try not to check my work email on the weekends. And I have that in my syllabus too, that I don't email students on the weekends because I'm like, you need to go and have your own time, which gets into kind of protecting ourselves too. I've had students send me pictures of the ER after they've been bitten by spiders. And that happened to me twice now. Let's see, that's a private message to me. I'll follow up with you in a minute. So Megan, what's incredibly ableist and classist?
Just responding to the comment about faculty who require obituary, right? Just like evidence of that. And as a first year advisor working exclusively with first year students, I've even had to help students navigate professors denying them absences for religious holidays and having to navigate that.
That's so awful. I hate that this is still something that happens.
Something that comes up for me about this conversation, which is really interesting, is just the idea that I feel like there's just so many different boundaries that people set for themselves. And that's part of what we're discussing is when like someone's boundaries runs into someone else's boundaries. Like in the old days, these used to be the appropriate boundaries. And now they're different. And then people don't modify or become aware, or we just live in our own bubbles and we're like, well, this is how it was in my day. Like, I just feel like so much of that. And so when you have all these stacking generations and different people, it just, to me, it feels like what's appropriate and what's appropriate shifts and changes, and boundaries are a reflection of that. I don't know. I'm just sort of thinking out loud, but
Yeah,
So-
boundaries are a hard one. And if you've read the book Boundaries, they don't address this issue of when your boundaries can cross someone else's boundaries. So I'm glad you brought that up. It's something we've talked a lot about in just our household and where our boundaries between my husband and I and our kids and what's appropriate and not appropriate. I wish that was covered in the book Boundaries, because it just talked about how you set a boundary. It doesn't get into what if your boundaries cross someone else's boundaries. Emmy?
Yeah, I had a question, and this came up in my breakout room too, but I've started including like a syllabus statement on course content that says, here are some of the things that we're going to be addressing this semester, just because I do teach classes where these kind of topics, like topics that could be traumatizing or re-traumatizing for students come up pretty frequently. But I'm wondering, I feel like I can improve my syllabus statement. So I guess I'm curious to hear what kind of things would be useful to include other than just this content is going to come up. Because I tend to say things like, you know, do what you need to do to take care of yourself if you feel, you know, triggered or traumatized by anything. Like you can leave the room during a class discussion, all of that, and ask students who are not experiencing that reaction to be mindful that others might. But I guess I'm just wondering, like, what could be included in that kind of statement.
So the CTL did a workshop a couple of years ago, and I think they still do it on how to write an inclusion statement for your syllabus. And so I would look towards those guidelines for bringing up, hey, this is what comes up in class. And I also would bring that up again in class. With just like, because I always preview what's coming up with my students. So I'll say, hey, we've got blah, blah, blah coming up. And so I usually try to do those gentle reminders. So I have it on my syllabus and I say it, hey, next week in class, we're going to be talking about the non-genetics of race. We're going to spend a whole class period on it. Just be aware that if you need to step out, that's fine. Or sometimes like when it's part of the standard content for the genetics class to talk about miscarriage. And I usually say to the students, hey, I might have to take a break today. Feel free if you need to take a break as well. So that also gets back to that idea of modeling too. So saying it in class, I put trigger warning right on my slides too of, hey, remember, this is what we're doing today. So hopefully that gives you some ideas. All right, and then Kara, right? You have your hand up as well?
Yes. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and I know that we don't have much more time, so sorry but something came up in one of our breakout rooms that I thought would be interesting was this idea that like I'm a staff person, so I'm not a teacher in a classroom. I'm not actually doing any teaching or working with students, but I often feel caught in the middle between student experience and what's going on in classrooms, because I'm not a supervisor. I'm not someone who's giving grades. So I think students will come to me and tell me things that are going on and want me to do something about it. And there's still that unequal power dynamic for me with faculty, you know, like it's just sort of an interesting dynamic with the secondary trauma, which I know David mentioned. And I appreciate you saying that, David, at the beginning, because I feel sometimes secondarily traumatized by hearing the stories and then also not being able to really do anything about it either because of the unequal power imbalance. And so even me just getting in front of a professor sometime and getting in their face or trying to say, hey, like then I'm put in a position of trying to have a difficult conversation with somebody or trying to coach a student about how to have a difficult conversation or sending them to CAPS so they can figure out how to have a difficult conversation, you know, where I don't want to be like put in the middle of something because I actually don't have necessarily any more power in the dynamic or the situation. I'm just in the middle as a staff person. So this is like a tangent off of a variety of things we're talking about today, but listening to Megan and Megan also sharing that being a first year advisor, like I feel like I'm a grad student advisor, so I get a lot of that kind of same stuff. So anyway, little tangent.
I'm glad you brought that up. That's a really good point. As I've run into it as a faculty member, people will come in and say such and such a faculty member is doing X, Y, Z. And it's like, well, it's not my job to go and talk to Dr. So-and-so about what they're doing in their classroom. But at the same time, you know, we have 18-year-old kids that is it reasonable to expect them to be advocating for themselves against something like this? It would be nice if there was a way to do, I can't think of what the word is. Like they have safe to tell in our school districts here. So if you see something, you can make an anonymous statement of, hey, I have a lot of students talking about Dr. So-and-so in chemistry.
Yeah, I don't know either. I mean, short of telling them to go to CAPS and to talk about it with somebody who's more of a trained professional, because I also don't have the time. Like I'm not a trained professional, you know, so I don't want to be put in the position of needing to coach somebody through something like that. And yet I also think about how, like as humans, people are also still developing, right? Like 18 to 21-year-olds, that's still a very like big developmental phase in life. And like, so it is important to learn the skills one needs to have to learn how to deal with conflict. But yeah, maybe we don't deal with like the high stakes conflict first. You know, what are the smaller ways that people can learn conflict resolution skills before they get all the way to like the big fish? These are just like I said, just different ideas I'm having off the cuff. But thanks.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought it up. It's a really good point. And Megan was asking about the SSCM case managers, and I've never used an SSCM case manager in this regard. I know there was a lot of complaints about someone in chemistry last year, and I ended up saying something to my supervisor of, hey, I've had a lot of students bring up issues with Dr. So-and-so. Yeah. And I see this as also a an equity issue too, because first gen students are much less likely to advocate for themselves too. I don't know if they can. Okay, I know we're out over time, so.
Well, and I hate to even interrupt. This is such great dialogue and kind of resource sharing and idea sharing. But I did note that Dr. Peffer put her email in the chat. So it seems like you may be open for additional questions if they happen to come up. So I do want to be mindful we're a little bit over time. So first, thank you to all of our participants. This was a really rich dialogue and I've learned so much. And also, if all of us could share a little love with Dr. Peffer for her great insights, her evidence-based recommendations, and certainly her care for our community. So thank you all. I know the planning committee for the Disability Symposium will be sending out feedback forms later, so would love to have your insights too.
Awesome.
Well,
Thank
thanks
you,
again,
everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Yep. Bye-bye.